Great. So we are going a little bit out of lectionary. It's the We're coming up to the first Sunday of year C because Advent starts the new lectionary year. Year C is dedicated to an emphasis on the Gospel of Luke. We'll talk about that in in a few weeks. But I don't know, Advent is strange for me this year. I think we've all had a lot of feelings in the last month. Um, and the normal Advent readings kind of just seemed a little insufficient. My thought was to actually, for the next 4 weeks, talk about a little bit of Jesus's genealogy. Um, and it turns out we're going to have to go outside of the Gospel of Luke for that because Luke only traces the male descendants of Jesus and doesn't really do a great job of that either historically. Um, Not to say that Matthew is any more accurate, but the other genealogy comes from Matthew, and that's more interesting because it includes four women. There are 4 Sundays in Advent, and so I thought maybe we talk about the four women that are in Jesus's genealogy, as declared by the Gospel of Matthew. I'm sure that there were other women as well, and that men did not beget men by themselves. Uh, and just to start off, like Ruth is a fantastic book. I think as a someone who feels a little lonely in Christianity sometimes, uh, because there are so many voices that are very, very different than mine, um, that are a little bit more, I don't know, foundationalist, that read the text more to set a very different social agenda than what I think the Bible does. I come to Christianity and the Bible sometimes with some fear of like that I am somehow reading too much of myself into it, or that I am not going to be satisfied by the text, or I'm going to be embarrassed by the text because it's a little bit conservative itself. Like the Bible, let's just be plain about it, is pretty okay with slavery. The Bible is pretty unarguably not kind to gay people or women. Um, so you know, I come with that fear, and it's important to name. Getting ready for this Bible study was amazing for me as a spiritual exercise because it's one of those rare moments where the Bible is even better than I imagined. Like this text, I thought I understood Ruth, and I thought like I kind of came in with an idea of what I wanted to teach, and then studying it, I was blown away, and that got thrown away really quickly. Like the text is even more progressive, even more subversive, even more like hopeful than I would have ever imagined, than I knew. And so, I just wanted to mention that as a that's where I'm at right now. And I hope that experience can be infectious and shared because I think we could use a little bit of that hope right now. So let's talk about Ruth. Okay. So Ruth is a book. But before we get to Ruth, let's practice our method. Um, our method is to look at the world, to look at how Christians have shaped the world. Christian faith has shaped the world. To look at the text only after we've had a good understanding of how we've had an effect in the world, then to ask some interesting questions about how the text contributes to the way that Christians have shaped the world, and then to wonder if there are other ways that the text could be used instead, if that's good or bad. Um, and then for that to become our new interpretation, our new lens to see the world and to look at the world again. So it's a cycle of interpretation. It's the method that we practice here with our studies, and we're going to be really explicit about that. So let's look at the world. This was an article that I thought was a really good read. It's from the New York Times, um, and it sought to explain some of the how does it work on a psychological, sociological level. Why the language before the election got so much worse in terms of being just really so toxically masculine and so xenophobic. Um, and the conclusion of this article, it's uh, by Charles Blow. Um, it's specifically that the anti-immigration language focuses on white female victims of brown male perpetrators. Uh, so, so the article says in 2015, when Trump said when Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best, they're not sending you, and ended with, they're rapists. It was one stanza in a long speech. And that theme is core to his political pitch. The language he uses with increasing frequency and vitriol is meant to trigger the defender impulse in men. It's the birth of a nation But instead of native-born black men being the scary other, it's men from the Caribbean, Mexico, and Central and South America. It's a way of valorizing the instinct to punish immigrants, whether it be through a Muslim travel ban, family separations, or possibly rounding up millions of people for deportation. The author continues, to my ear, Trump is telling men that voting for him is the only way to validate their manliness. He calls to defend women, unborn children, and cisgendered female athletes. Are ways of drafting men into his legions. Those calls seem to be connecting with men who feel that their social dominance is slipping. Trump, by all appearances, isn't just toxic. He's a toxic man's man. He wants to be seen that way. His version of a shirtless Vladimir Putin. He's betting that his road back to the White House runs through the haze of testosterone. He's summoning it with language that is rarely given voice in the company of women that he swears he loves but constantly diminishes. So, to see this idea of immigration through multiple lenses, that it's not only xenophobia, but it's something about masculinity. It's something about white fear of replacement. It's something about white male fear. And more importantly, it's the consequence of a voting group, essentializing their identity to power. What I mean by that is, what does it mean for me to be Japanese American? I don't know. It's some common narrative, a culture about a shared immigration story. It's about certain festivals that are important, certain ways of understanding human nature. Like you can't be Japanese without understanding bachi, like instant karma, or how problematic every Japanese son's relationship is with his mother. That is just core to being Japanese. But that's what it means for me. Those are parts of what it means for me to be my cultural identity in terms of my gender, my ethnicity, my race. But for some people, especially white men, what it means to be their identity is to be powerful. And so when that's threatened, it's not just a change in power sharing. It's a threat to identity itself. That's the problem. And that's partly why all these things about maleness and immigration, race, national origin, all intersect. And by pulling on those strings, all of it unravels, right? So we're talking about immigration specifically through the text of Ruth today, but we're talking about so much more than that. I just wanted to begin there, right? So we look at the world. And this has some theory behind it. So for example, one of the core texts for understanding Sassan's globalization and its discontents back in the 80s gives us some insight. Immigration has traditionally aroused strong passions in the United States. Although Americans like to profess pride in their history as a nation of immigrants, each group of arrivals, once established, has fought to keep newcomers out. Over the past 2 centuries, each new wave of immigrants has encountered strenuous opposition from earlier arrivals, who have insisted that the country was already filled to capacity. The single exception to this was the South's eagerness to import ever more slaves. So, I mean, there's several burns in that, but it's a observation that this phenomena that we are an immigrant nation that hates immigrants has been around for a long time. And to go further into that, to quote none other than Benjamin Franklin himself. So this is a first or second generation immigrant dealing at a time when most of the nation were immigrants. So he writes in 1750, after German farmers settled in Pennsylvania, Benjamin Franklin worried about their, quote, political immaturity and social incivility. He said that those who come hither are generally the most stupid of their own nation. Not being used to liberty, they know not how to make a modest use of it. This is in his observations concerning the increase of mankind. I'm sorry, I should have given this citation. He asks, and let's be clear about who he's asking this about German immigrants who pretty white. He asks, why should the Palatine Boers be suffered to swarm into our settlements and by herding together establish their language and manners to the exclusion of ours? Why should Pennsylvania, founded by the English, become a colony of aliens who will shortly be so numerous as to Germanize us instead of our own Anglifying them? So the idea that Trump is playing on of those other nations are sending the worst is not anything new. It's not exclusive to brown people or yellow people or anyone of racial ethnicity. It's not about skin color. It's about pure xenophobia. And it's very old. It's baked into our national identity. Proving the point from Sasson. This has been used against the French, the Irish, the Italians, Jews, Japanese, Chinese, Greeks, Poles. Right now, it seems like the most vulnerable are people from the parts of the world to our south that we have exploited. Let's be quite clear, for bananas. If you really want an interesting read about how we've destabilized Guatemala about through just bananas, like, I've got a good book for you. The concern is that immigrants will change us. And they have. It's what it is. Got a video clip for us. This is from Saturday Night Live, which I'm sure we have the copyright to be able to use.
Because my dad's an immigrant. Like, he made it in this country. Like, he made it against all odds. Like, he made it so hard that he's a Republican now. Like, that's the real American dream, dude. To go from, like, village in Lebanon to being like, no, don't let more in. No, sorry about that. No, sorry, white guys only. Come on, Kyle, let's go play pickleball.
I mean, benignly, this phenomena are those people on planes who, as they're boarding the plane and the flight attendant is telling us all, please, like, make sure that to put your bags, your roll-ons upright so that more people can fit into the bins, and it's the people that as soon as they're in the plane and their bag is up there, like, leave it on its side, on its back, so that, to block more, because they don't care, they're in. Who cares about the people that come after them? But it's true. There's something about our human nature that doesn't connect ourselves through our empathy with those that come after us. It's really sad.
My dad's an immigrant.
Sorry. Let me get to the next slide. Okay. And it can be really insane sometimes. I wish I made this headline up. Our inability to remember history. And I don't even know what to do with this. Dan Foreman was at a public town hall where candidates were speaking about their platforms and was very, very concerned or very angered by some of the discussion, and accused one of the candidates who was running for the Idaho House of Representatives, telling her to go back where she came from. The problem was that she is definitely First Nation, I believe, Nez Perce. So great. Okay. So remember, this is what we do as a church. This is how we are. Giving Circle. We see, we think, we act, we evaluate, and we celebrate. So this whole cycle of what we're doing tonight is part of how we are church. So we start by seeing, and we'll move on to some of the thinking now. So we looked at, just to remind us of our process, what are common beliefs and practices out there in the world? It means that at the end of the day, the point of this Bible study is not that you learn things about a passage, it's that you learn a method. I can't tell you what to think. I shouldn't tell you what to think. It would be wrong of me to tell you what to think. But I think my role here, my value to you, is to help you to understand one way of how to think. You can take it or leave it. But we should name this explicitly. This is a method that comes from Latin America that is called liberation theology, or the liberation practice of ver pensar, to see and to think, but to see first. And that's what makes it so different from many of the other traditional models in the United States, which think first, look at the Bible first, and then use that to color how they see the world, rather than seeing the world as it is first, and then thinking second. Cool. So just to review, that's where we were. Let's go move on. So who's afraid of immigrants? I'm going to try to make this a little bit more interactive. I mean, we've got a couple of people here. What are some of the things that we're told to be concerned about immigrants? It doesn't have to be a personal view. In fact, I'm going to bet that it isn't.
They're taking all the jobs.
Yeah, they take all the jobs. What about? What else? I'll go. Um, they're the source of crime. More importantly, violent crime. What's another one? Um, hmm. They'll never be like us. Anything else? Any other stereotypes about immigrants? Why we should fear them? I mean, given that like everyone on the call right now is a direct product of immigrants that are in recent memory, which is great and something I love about this church. Anything else? Okay, let's move on. We got this. We got this. So, here are the problems. Like, there are assumptions that are encoded into this that there's no more room, that we're complete as we are, that we have a stable identity, that the people who have the right to say these things are themselves not the products of immigration somehow. The thing that I think is particularly toxic, I don't know, I probably have no basis to say that. One of the things that I find the most difficult to discredit is the way that immigration discourse has camouflaged itself as not xenophobic, but about legal discourse. Um, Immigration is not the problem. It's illegal immigrants that are the problem. It's unlawfulness that's the problem. We're willing to be very, very happy about people who arrive here legally, like JD Vance's wife, for example, um, or Donald Trump's wife, who is here because of a genius visa, the kind of visa that was used to bring in Einstein, but that she received for her significant cultural contributions modeling without her clothes on. Let's be clear about that. That's our first lady, past and future. The assumption is that it's something about legality that is the magic wand that makes someone palatable for our culture, as if US citizens never do anything illegal, that lawful behavior is somehow, or potential lawful or unlawful behavior is measured by citizenship status or where you're born, or that really the laws themselves about immigration are just. Let's keep that in mind. Okay. So here's where we're discussing, as part of all of this, our awareness of the dominant ideologies and power structures in the world. And that's the exercise that we just went through. What are we told to think? So let's think about let's move on to the next step, which is, how does Christian belief support power? What are Christian beliefs? What are our religious beliefs? Let's look at our texts. So we're going to need to know some things about the societal culture that's operating here. One of them is the point about levirate marriages, and this is kind of weird. The important thing to know is that back in the day, ancient Near East societies contemporaneous with the 6th century BCE had protections for widows that allowed women to inherit, specifically widows to inherit, except for one people. That was Israel. So there is some extreme stress on the position of what it means to be a widow. A widow is defined at this point in time as someone that not only has lost their husband, but also no longer has a son or son-in-law either. And we think that maybe some of the prejudice against widows was because of an underlying suspicion that widows had somehow killed their husbands, which was unique to this culture. So levirate marriage was the idea that a married man, without a person to inherit, if he died, his wife was passed on to a brother in the family. The reason for doing that was to be able to keep property within a family. Property was support in an agrarian society, of course. Property was doled out in ways to sustain a family. So every Israelite family received a portion of land of, it was in the law, it was supposed to be like what a pair of oxen can plow in one day, or the amount of land that could be planted by a certain amount of seed. So it's inherently tied. Your inheritance, what you're given, is the right to be able to sustain yourself. And when you combine that with the inability of widows to inherit property, there's an extreme anxiety about how do you sustain widows. And they were the most vulnerable in society at this point because they couldn't inherit their means of sustenance because of these laws. So we're going to need to understand levirate marriage. These things are called levirate, and marriages, and we think that they largely fell into disuse by the time of the Second Temple period. That's when people came back from the exile in Babylon. Okay, what else to know? We're going to have to know about this people group called the Moabites. This is going to be real fun. So let's look at this map. Purple here on the other side of what we now call the Dead Sea. Interesting to note that the trajectory of in the text of the people coming to the promised land after they're wandering in the wilderness comes from the east. You would think it would travel in a sort of direct line from Egypt, from the south or the southwest, but they wander for a long time, 40 years, and you don't get there by traveling in a straight path. So their last stop before they finally enter the kingdom, or the promised land. So this is where Moses dies, for example, right on the border, and is buried, is the kingdom of Moab, the people that will be the kingdom of Moab. That's the beginning of this story, but it gets better. And let's situate this in time. So when does this story happen? And when is this story written? Those are two different things. We think that this story was written after, somewhere in this period here of 520 to 515 BCE, after the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem. So it's after the kingdom. There are no more kings. The people in authority at this point are this sect of scribe rulers who interpret the law. Membership in the community is determined by your adherence to the law, that this one scribe will tell you what it means. It's before the high priests. And also, there's a lot of tension because you have two groups of people in the same space. And every time you have that, it's going to be tense. You have the group that return from exile from after the Persian Empire released them from their Babylonian exile by conquering the Babylonian Empire. And you also have the people that never left. The people that never left are going to be a smaller group, and the people that returned are going to be a larger group. Who do you think is going to have more power, and who do you think is going to be the abused minority, right? So the people that stayed, that were never exiled, are viewed with suspicion by the people who left. And if you want to have another aspect to that story, go back to our Bible study on the book of Ezekiel, which is essentially, in large part, about the anxiety of the people in exile about who's going to have the land when we go back. That's what that book is about. It's really sad that that's what scripture is written for, to justify land ownership. Anyway, the things to know is that the people that stayed intermarried. So there's going to be a tension between the people who are in positions of power, who have the right, or who have claimed the right to interpret the law, and the people who are being so there's the religious legal access, right? I claim the right to interpret the scriptures, the law for you. There's the political axis, which is the people who stayed behind, who stayed on land, and the people that are coming back trying to reclaim their rights for land. And then there's the cultural, or the ethnic, which is the people that are still claiming to be pure, the returned diaspora, as opposed to the people that have stayed and have largely intermarried with other cultural groups. So it's a ripe and a very tense system. So let's talk a little bit more about Moabites. They factor into all of this. Where did the Moabites come from? They're not just a foreign people group. They're cousins. Lot, nephew of Abraham, the founder of the Israelite people, has a really bad night. The day before, his entire community has been killed by sulfur from above. This is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. This is where Lot chooses to live. Bad choice of locale. And all of his descendants have died. So his two daughters, biological daughters, have married residents of Sodom and Gomorrah. His son-in-laws stayed behind and were killed. So he's got two daughters and he's fled with them. His wife has already been turned to a pillar of salt, which is one of the more bizarre stories of the whole thing. And the two daughters are concerned about inheritance and descendants. Two separate things. Let's note though. There are no inheritance, and because they're daughters, they have no right to inherit land or to make a claim on land. They solve this in a rather interesting way, and that method is incest. So older daughter goes first and gets her father drunk and sleeps with him. And then younger daughter the next night continues the same. The product of those unions are other people groups, according to the narrative, and the people that are descendant from the child born to the older daughter from her union with her father are the Moabites. So it's not going to be great for them. Going on, I told you that Israel, like the geographic position of Moab is important. That's to the east, that you have to pass through Moab and is the last stop before you get to Israel. In the story about that is recounted in Numbers chapter 25. And while the Israelites were camped with their cousins, the Moabites at this point have developed the worship of a different god, Chemosh. And through the seduction of the Israelites, they begin to sacrifice and worship other gods, specifically to Chemosh, and this pisses God off. So there's a theological reason for the distrust, as well as a cultural kind of, you know, they've already broken some other taboos. Goes on. It gets better. Um, because of this, and because of the inhospitality or the poor hospitality that the Moabites show, they suffer. They got um, they basically get banned. So Deuteronomy goes on afterwards to say that no Moabite will ever be allowed into the community of Israelites. Do not intermarry with the Moabites. Um, and as in Deuteronomy 7, there are a bit of other people that you shouldn't marry. Um, the weird thing is that uh, how to measure just how much like the text record this animosity toward the Moabites. Even other kin groups like the Edomites, who are the descendants of Jacob's brother Esau, or the Egyptians, uh, who enslaved the Israelites, are allowed back in. So if you have a mixed marriage with an Egyptian, eventually the kids that are descended from that can be considered Israelite. The problem is the Moabites. No matter how many generations, so this is an expression in the text, um, they will not be included. So there is something that is recorded here that gets really bad. Ezra is important here. Let's mention that. Ezra is one of the first scribes after the return from exile, and as position of scribe gets to interpret laws, essentially both a political theocratic ruler, an absolute ruler. If you agree with Ezra, you're okay. If not, then you get kicked out of the community. The period that's recorded in history, that's the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, record two instances of something really, really cruel. Um, and it's this period in which all um, all people of mixed marriages are divorced, and all children that result from mixed marriages are banned. And I don't mean like they don't get good jobs. I mean like they're sent out. It's this incredible, painful, cruel uh, reading of the law, reading of what we see here in Deuteronomy, that splits families, that really destroys people. And so this is actually the historical period that we think that Ruth was written in reaction to two successive rulers who interpret the law in a way that splits families and that deports all immigrants. Um, so here's where you get that. For example, in Ezra 9, even Egyptians are allowed back into the community eventually. So we get the sense of Moabites are somehow even worse than the people that enslaved the Egyptians. Okay, so we've just talked about how does the interpretive cycle, how does Christian power, or rather, what are the implications of our faith? So these are how the texts tell us to talk about immigrants. We could summarize that to say briefly that essentially we have to be aware that the what are the Hebrew scriptures are written from the perspective of not just religion, but an ethnicity as well. And there's an extreme apprehension about not just religious purity, but cultural purity as well. And if we don't aren't aware of that, if we don't think about that, then we might take the whole text on and own concerns that are not really ours. or that we could be a little bit more suspicious about. More recently, like how does Christianity talk about immigration? Well, we have to understand liberal progressive Christianity is a very small minority, and the vast majority of Christianity in the United States, at least, is very, very fundamentalist and very, very, I don't know, maybe there's a better word, but the word that comes to mind is wrong. Um, for example, you've got cranks like James Dobson, who is a very evangelical, um, very influential evangelical leader, to the extent that the New York Times once named him as the most important evangelical leader in the country. At the height of his power, he was running a $160 million annual budget organization that was getting like 13,000 pieces of correspondence from people asking for advice a day. In 2019, after visiting the border to the south, he wrote something like, to quote, I can only report that without an overhaul of the law and the allocation of resources, millions of illegal immigrants will continue flooding to this great land from around the world. Many of them have no marketable skills. They are illiterate and unhealthy. Some are violent criminals. Their numbers will soon overwhelm the culture as we know it, and it could bankrupt the nation. America has been a wonderfully generous and caring country since its founding. That is our Christian nature, but in this instance, we have met a worldwide wave of poverty that will take us down if we don't deal with it. And it won't take long for the inevitable consequence to happen. I have no idea what the inevitable consequence he's talking about is. But the point is that we have to understand that it's not just only our Christian belief, but how does the majority of Christianity respond to immigration? This is all setting the context for us to understand the world around us and finally come to the text. So let's do that. Oh, sorry. Here's the quotation I just read from. So we come to the text with questions. Questions like, does God care for non-Israelites, given what we've seen in the law? What role do foreigners have in the world if God doesn't care about them? Why are they there? Like God who does creation, um, who creates all people. Why would God create people that are given more advantage or that are beloved? Why does God have a chosen people? How could God, the God of all creation, God of all love, have people that God loves more? Um, you know, um, when in Exodus 20, when the Exodus happens, when people when the Jews leave Egypt, um, they're given a covenant that includes the Ten Commandments. They're told to not mistreat or oppress foreigners. Um, why why does the text create this tension about people who are on an in-group and an out-group? If we go back to the story about Israel's identity, we look at Exodus, the story of Israel being liberated from slavery. The covenant that's the very beginning of which we know as the Ten Commandments is much longer than that. And immediately the next verse after the Ten Commandments, well, includes do not mistreat or oppress foreigners, for once you were foreigners in Egypt. Right? That sounds great. Do not oppress foreigners, for you know what it is to be a foreigner. But then Leviticus goes on to say, do not mistreat the foreigners who reside in your land. The foreigner who lives among you must be treated like one of your own. Love them as you would love yourself, for you too were a foreigner in the land of Egypt. That's great. And you could argue that those protections only apply to legal immigrants. And none of the biblical passages restrict the definition of foreigner in this way. The concern is humanitarian. You know what it was like to be a foreigner, so you should treat them accordingly, just like the golden rule. And indeed, foreigners are treated equally in front of the law. Well, foreigners experience the same restrictions of the law, but maybe don't experience the same rights. The problem is that, like Numbers chapter 15 is a good example. But this is in the context of a much larger body in which foreigners are not treated well. Um, for example, in Leviticus 25, there's a differentiation created between slaves who are foreigners as opposed to slaves who are Hebrews, right? You can enslave your own kind. That's great. It's said that slaves who are Hebrews are protected in many ways, but and one of those is that you are not allowed to be ruthless toward them, but it's silent about how you can treat slaves who are foreigners. The implication being that you can treat them ruthlessly. And the important thing there is that the word for ruthless is the same word for how Egyptians treated them in the Hebrew. The biblical text is not equally divided. It is wrong to say that the Bible is neither pro nor anti-immigrant. It's just kind of neutral. The overarching principle is that the experience of Israel as a foreigner in Egypt, which at least for the Northern Kingdom is the national founding myth, is that sympathy for the foreigner takes precedence over other considerations. So there are laws that treat slaves very, very poorly, but the greater narrative is a demand for slaves, or sorry, for foreigners to be treated with an overabundance of kindness. The Exodus isn't the only time when Israel would know what it's like to be a foreigner. There is the diaspora as well. After the defeat of the Northern Kingdom by the Assyrians, there is the Exodus, or there's the exile. But Job gives us a theological reason that's much more fundamental. It's not grounded in compassion or fairness. Job speaks, he's talking about male and female slaves, when he protests his innocence, he says, "Didn't the one who made me in the womb also make them? Didn't the same one form us both in the womb?" Looking at the equality of all people as being part of the same creation, it's as close as the Hebrew text gets to the concept of an inalienable human right. When people use the law and the legalism of the Hebrew scriptures to argue that immigration must conform to an exclusionary legal tradition, the idea that there are legal versus illegal immigrants, the Bible responds in a way that's primarily motivated with love. The Bible translates this word as a word that showed up in the first slide as Hesed, loving kindness, which has a tone, the way it's used, of extravagance. That there is something not necessarily in the letter of the law, but that is crucial to understanding the law, which, remember again, in the Second Temple period, is the way that you understand your identity. The thing that defines you as being a legal citizen is your adherence to the law. But that identity is best understood in your ability to live in a way that was loving. So the end of the day, the argument is not just simply love, or rather isn't just simply following the law, but it's in a greater context of adhering to Hesed, to loving kindness. It's a generous act that goes beyond the requirements of simply the law. So you can't separate, or you can't think to yourself that law gives us identity, right? Am I a legal immigrant? Therefore, I have the identity of being a citizen. Because there is a third part of this outside of that tradition, which is about extravagance, about love. So let's get to Ruth now, finally. And what this previous slides, let's go to the text. So we've got the story of Ruth. In Ruth, the judges governed Israel. So we've got a time setting. This is a story written during Ezra and Nehemiah in reaction to two successive rulers that demanded that all mixed marriages be split, that families be deported, that children be deported. Sounds familiar? And we've got a story set in a much earlier time period to give the sense of something like mythic, something that cannot be argued, of a purer time when the rules were more clear, when the principles were more clear. A family, because of a famine, an Israelite family, leaves. The family consists of a father and a wife, 2 sons. In the new land, in their new home, they marry 2 foreign daughters. All the men in this family suddenly die. So Elimelech, the father, dies, as well as his 2 sons in verse 5, Mahlon and Chilion. So the family then suddenly shrinks to a mother-in-law, or mother, and 2 daughters-in-laws. The 2 daughters-in-laws are neither of whom have children, and they're both Moabite. So the land where these 2 people, or where this family settled, is Moab. So you have 3 women, 2 foreigners, all childless, all widows, who then have no other option other than to return to the origin of their identity, which is through their husbands, to Judah, or rather to Israel. And they return as essentially the ultimate outsider. So they're widows, they're women, they're foreigners, not just foreigners, they're Moabites, they're childless, they're landless, they're poor. Everything about them is vulnerable. The story also retells a new beginning, because it retells the story of how the Israelites came to the promised land. They came from Moab. So it is a story of new beginning, of recreating that narrative of what had happened before. The whole book is a commentary on law. It seems to be about inheritance and patriarchy, because there's no one to inherit property. There's no sense of how these people are going to be secure. One of the 2 daughter-in-laws, Orpah, returns back to her family in Moab, her father, as she's instructed to do by her Jewish or Israelite mother-in-law, Naomi. The other daughter-in-law, Ruth, who's also Moabite, whose husband has died, remains with Naomi and travels with her back to the home of her father-in-law and her husband. That's the story of Ruth. It's 4 chapters long. It tells a story of love and devotion, and it ends with that story being the actual fulfillment of the law. In broad strokes, Ruth and Naomi will go on to meet a wealthy family member named Boaz, who is a distant relative and has the right to inherit. Right? Remember going back to levirate marriages, that a family member, a male family member, would marry a widow to be able to continue property inheritance within a family, to keep property in the family. Because of this family relationship, Boaz has the possibility of either marrying Naomi or Ruth. And the product of either of those marriages will be counted, because of levirate marriages, as being Elimelech's heirs. So they will not be only his heirs, they will also they will primarily be Elimelech's heirs, which is the dead father of this whole family, because property is inherited through Boaz, almost as like a proxy to be able to continue a family line, but it has to be through the guy. It's a weird thing, but this is how families were able to continue to inherit and pass on property. there is in these 4 chapters the problem in chapter 1 that these deaths leave these women vulnerable, and there's a resolution in chapter 4. Not gonna to keep you in suspense. Boaz marries Ruth. It's a story about, depending on how you tell it, the seduction of Boaz or Boaz's kindness to Ruth, and some a few stories of trickery in the middle. Okay, let's move on. So after the story has been set up, we're getting now to the resolution. Boaz has recognized Ruth and has commended her for her loyalty to Naomi, even though she's a foreigner, even though she's not required by the law to stay with her mother-in-law. And their economic prospects are a little bit less insecure. They've at least got a steady food supply. Why? Because Ruth has begun to do something called gleaning, which is terribly hard work. It's picking out grain that has been left behind after a field has been harvested. It's a right that's given to widows in the law. So again, this story is based upon so many allusions to the law. It's really absolutely a commentary on the law. And just so that we're aware, we're about 10 minutes away from being done with this, and we're only 4 slides from the end, so we're good. So chapter 3, this is where Naomi begins to enact the plan of not just day-to-day sustenance, how are we going to feed ourselves, but how are we going to continue the family line? How are we going to continue to create heirs and to be secure economically as well as societally? Sorry, one more thing, let me go back. At the very bottom of this passage, Ruth pledges her allegiance to Naomi. That's going to be important. What you see throughout this is there is a fluidity of relationships. Ruth is formally Naomi's daughter-in-law, but if you look at this language, she becomes Naomi's daughter. She's referred to by Naomi as my daughter in verse 12. In verse 14, when Ruth clings to Naomi, that is specific language that references Genesis chapter 2, when God talks about clinging a husband to wife. So by clinging to Naomi, Ruth is being used, the language there is being used to describe Ruth as being Naomi's husband. Later on in this, Ruth will take on the role of the mother of Naomi's child. There is a fluidity to gender relationships in this, which is amazing. And Naomi similarly also experiences many different roles. The point is that the living out of the law through the lens of love, I'm just going to spoil this for you right now, is liberating. It doesn't confine people to individual roles. And that's what we're seeing. If you're already starting to read through this text as it's posted, and you see so many like conflicting relationship identifiers like daughter-in-law and daughter, husband, whatever, how does Ruth function in relationship to Naomi? The point is that love is fluid and creates these changing relationships. And I think that's something that we can resonate with, that we know to be true. Great. Okay. Let's keep going. Okay, back to this, chapter 3. So Naomi's big plan is that she is going to marry Ruth off to Boaz. The important word here is redeemer. That is a formal legal role. And the reason that this is important for Advent is because that we talk about Jesus as being a redeemer. And that's really kind of interesting and sometimes a little bit weird. So for example, what's highlighted in yellow is that Ruth identifies Boaz as "you are my family's redeemer." In Hebrew, goel is the term here. What's the difference between a redeemer and a savior? We talk about, is Jesus my savior, Jesus my redeemer? Any thoughts? Well, um, when I think about the term redeemer, I think about coupons. Somehow, like I redeem, I trade a coupon and I get something. Um, to save something, if I mean, this has never happened to me because I'm not that courageous. But if you were to save a life, that person doesn't owe you anything. Uh, you did it out of the goodness of your heart. You saved them. They went on their way. You went on yours. Um, you saw uh someone lose their balance at the edge of a cliff or whatever. You just like pulled them back and you said like, geez, like you shouldn't be that close. Or, like keep going. Like don't stop there. Um, a redeemer, on the other hand, if you give up something of value, you get something back. The interesting thing about the Hebrew scriptures is the word redeemer is oftentimes used as an understanding of God. And when we talk about God that way, Jesus that way, there's an exchange of ownership. For example, why God says you shouldn't sell yourselves into slavery, my people that I have rescued, is because I have redeemed you. The implication being you can't be slaves and owned by someone else because I own you. I saved you from slavery, but I didn't save you for your own reason. I saved you because now I own you. I redeemed you. Um, the idea being that's operative in Ruth is that Boaz has to function in a legal term as the redeemer of family property. So he is going to do something in exchange for being able to reclaim family property. And it's going to come at cost to himself, but that will give himself ownership of some way. Um, that's going to be important for us. Okay, great. So the the idea here being that Naomi has this plan, um, that Ruth will approach Boaz at a particularly vulnerable moment after a long day of work harvesting, when he's had a lot to drink and eat and he's asleep. Um, and she will lie next to him and do something. We're unclear about exactly uh, what that thing is. There are some interpreters that will find a very sexual role in this, and that Boaz is now kind of yoked to Ruth because there's the possibility of an illegitimate child, so that there was intercourse. And some commentators will see this as being purely innocent, well, not innocent, but purely respectful, and that there was no sexual relation. Regardless, we know that this is a very provocative move that Naomi convinces Ruth to initiate. It's an instance of women taking initiative and taking responsibility for the narrative here. Regardless, the proposal is received well. Naomi tells Ruth to do something. Ruth does it to Boaz to initiate a relationship, and Boaz responds favorably. We don't know whether Boaz is responding purely in his role as redeemer or there's actually interest. I don't think romance is a concept that applies here. It's just kind of foreign. The point, though, is its similarity to the story in Genesis 19, which tells us the origin of the Moabites. And the parallels here, it's a story about one man and two women, Naomi and Ruth, or Lot and his two daughters. Um, it's a story that occurs after the death of two men, in this case, two sons-in-law, or the death of Lot's sons-in-law. It's about the destiny of immigrants. It's a story about women seeking to resolve the problem of descent. Um, in both encounters, the older woman, Naomi, or the older daughter, initiates this story. Both Lot and Boaz are drunk, and in both cases, it's a relationship of daughter, which is weird, right? Because clearly in Lot's case, it's daughters. Here, Boaz refers to Naomi or to Ruth as my daughter. And we think that that's intentional. So it's a story that has an antecedent not only in Ruth as being a Moabite, but it's a story that changes the relationship between or challenges the relationship between Israel and the Moabites because of they're just like so many parallels. It's just not a coincidence. Um, but the point is that in the narrative, Boaz takes a liking to Ruth and agrees to become the family's redeemer. Somehow he will help legally transfer property and become the way that Ruth and Naomi, by extension, have a male protector. But there's a plot twist. Turns out there's someone that's more closely related to Naomi, and as a result, has a stronger claim on her husband's property. And so there's this story that's concocted in chapter 4, 1 through 6, where Boaz has to trick this other guy who doesn't ever receive a name in this narrative into renouncing his right. And so he says, in front of the elders of the community, he says, Naomi has a piece of property, which is the first time we've heard of this in this entire story. This property has never been mentioned. So the property is the bait. And says, Naomi has a piece of property that's up for sale. It belonged to her husband, but she can't own it. Because she can't own it, it has to be sold. You have the first right because you're the closest male relative. And the closest male relative says, yeah, of course, I'll take it. And then Boaz says, aha, but if you take the property, you also have to take Ruth the Moabite, who comes with all the stigmas of being Moabite. And the guy says, like, nope, never mind. I renounce it because I don't really want, like, having like Ruth in my family complicates things. Here's the thing, though. We know that this story is concocted. Why? Because the law only applies to Israelites. Anyone who knew the law well would know that there was no obligation for a closest male relative to also marry Ruth, because Ruth was not an Israelite. The point of all of this is that this story plays fast and loose with the law. Let's bring this back to the present. In 1882, there's the Chinese Exclusion Act here in the United States. It's the only law ever written to exclude naturalization or entry based on a country of origin. If you were born in China, you could not, after 1882, legally come to this country or ever become a naturalized citizen. There was a Supreme Court case in 1898, U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark, that clarified that if you were born to here in the United States to a U.S. citizen, but had Chinese origin, you could still become a citizen. The 1924 Immigration Act expands this understanding to other ethnicities as well, other Asian groups, Japanese, Koreans, also, and sets up a strict quota system for people like Italians, who we think of as being, terribly important for the fabric of America, and Eastern Europeans as well. The crazy thing about this Exclusion Act is the fire and the earthquake in 1906 in San Francisco, when many public records were lost. This created the concept or the phenomenon of paper sons and daughters. People began to claim that they were the descendants of legal of U.S. citizens, but that their documentation had been lost, and were able to then claim citizenship. In even if the Chinese Exclusion Act was still in operation, it was a workaround. It gave citizenship to a lot of specifically Chinese, but many other Asian immigrants in the Bay Area, who were willing to understand that like the law is not necessarily the end all be all of who gets to be a citizen. That there were rights about belonging that were not necessarily in compliance with law. I just mentioned that to be a modern day example of how the text here operates, that there are greater principles other than law that are in the Bible about who gets to be included or not. Remember what we looked at in Deuteronomy and Numbers, that no one who had any Moabite parentage could ever be included in the understanding of what it meant to be an Israelite. And then let's go to the conclusion of this book. Second to last slide. So we're almost done. So Ruth and Boaz are married. Ruth has a child. And this is where it gets weird, right? Because the child is born to Naomi. So again, the idea of what it means to have a greater understanding of love, not just the law, is here encoded in this idea of Naomi's really fluid relationship. But let's go down to a son has been born to Naomi through Ruth. His name is Obed. Obed begot Jesse, and Jesse begot David. So the king, David, who is the beginning of the Davidic covenant, the permanent union of Yahweh to the kingship in Zion, in Jerusalem, comes through just 2 generations intermediate, a Moabite, which by law cannot ever be part of the nation of Israel. So David's identity is in contravenes the law. And then again, coming back to where we started, that we're in Advent. According to the genealogy of Matthew, 14 generations later, Jesus is born, the son of David. So the 2 religions that we're talking about, both Judaism as well as Christianity, owe their identity to central characters who have unique relationships with God, who by the law should have no right in this community. The point of all of this, one point that I'm trying to make, is that back to those questions. Does God have a place for people who are not part of this chosen group? Absolutely. Our focus as Christians, can it be on questions of legality? Sorry, let me go to this. We come back to the last one, a new interpretation. This scripture of Ruth tells us that the laws do not have the last say, that laws must be understood in the greater context of love. That if we look at the idea of immigration as a theme in the Bible, we see that the most important characters are themselves illegal immigrants, perpetually illegal immigrants. That there is no safe ground to be xenophobic here. It's not, you can't, not just about not liking people that are other than you. You want to even like try to code this as about, well, it's about legal immigration or not. Even people who are termed illegal immigrants are central to our understanding of our identity as people of faith. We cannot faithfully read the Bible and faithfully be unkind to immigrants. That's simply there in our Christian faith. And that's the message of salvation. That's the message of Jesus. That's the message of Advent. We have hope because the salvation of the world is brought through people who would not be otherwise if it were not for we so callously and so thoughtlessly call illegal immigration. That's what it is. Okay, we're done.